right, this is the second set of notes on plant life cycles. This one's going to be much shorter than the one from yesterday because we don't have to go over alternation of generations again. We're just going to look at the life cycle of ferns and their relatives. So that's the second evolutionary group of plants. A few reminders, make sure you have that handout, fill it in as you go. I don't have it on here, but make sure that you are filling in labels for diagrams. Don't forget those. And then also make sure you have audio. Some of the slides, especially the life cycle slides, I just describe it step by step, but it's not written on the slides, so feel free to add what you need to understand that slide when you refer back to it in the future. Okay, so let's go ahead and start by recalling from yesterday. We looked at the life cycle of mosses and the relatives. So when it comes to this big evolutionary tree, mosses and their relatives are the simplest, the most closely related or closely similar to what would have been a common ancestor plant similar to green algae. Okay, so these plants do have some things that are unique, like the use of spores for reproduction and so on. We're going to see some of those similarities with the next group that we're going to talk about, but we're going to move on to the effects of this evolutionary trait, which is vascular tissue, and talk about the life cycle of ferns and their relatives. Now, noticing on this evolutionary tree, ferns and their relatives are unique in that they have this vascular tissue, but they don't have seeds yet. So they have a very unique way that they reproduce, and that's what this plant life cycle we're learning about today is going to talk about. Okay, so with bryophytes from yesterday, I mentioned that they are very simple, but there's a bit of a water dilemma when it comes to bryophytes. They actually have only one way to transport water. We talked about it yesterday. They don't really have that vascular system, so these plants have to rely on just having the majority of the plant being very near water so that water can just go into the plant by osmosis from cell to cell. So the problem with that, though, is because of this reliance on osmosis, these plants can't grow too far from the ground. They have to limit their size to just a few centimeters. If they grew any taller, then the tallest parts of the plant wouldn't be able to get things like water from the surrounding soil, or be able to reproduce because water is needed for the reproduction. Okay, so you have this problem of, well, not necessarily problem, but for a very long time, plants were primarily just this height and they couldn't get any bigger. And then about 420 million years ago, in the fossil record, we start to see evidence of plants that are taller. And so the reason they're taller, if we were to zoom in and look at their fossil tissues, is we can see special cells start to show up. And these special cells create an internal transport system for things like water and dissolved nutrients to be able to travel further away from ground level. Okay, so this internal system is what we call vascular tissue, and we have a separate unit that looks more in detail at what exactly is vascular tissue, but just simply put, there are specialized cells in vascular tissue, and they are built to act like tubes. So the ones that in particular that are kind of like the earliest ones that we see are things called tracheids, and it's a little hard to see, but you can see one tracheid here. It's attached end on end to another tracheid, and so they start forming what kind of seem like little hollow straw-like structures that run further away from the ground. Okay, and so things like water and nutrients can travel through them just like water would travel through a straw. Okay, so that's what tracheids are. Okay, and so the development of these specialized cells kind of marks the beginnings of this new group, which are ferns as well as their relatives. Now, we refer to this group as seedless vascular plants, and that kind of describes the main characteristics. So they are vascular, so they have things like true roots, true leaves, and stems that all have this vascular tissue, these tracheids in them. But also, they still use spores. So seeds haven't been didn't evolutionary, aren't haven't evolved yet, I should say, haven't evolved yet. So ferns and their relatives still use spores just like mosses and liverworts and hornworts do. Okay, so that's a unique characteristic. So in this group, we have ferns, which you can see an example of one here. There's a lot of species of ferns. I think somewhere upwards of like 11,000, so that's quite a lot. But then there are also a couple of other relatives that fall in this group too. Club mosses, which are a little bit similar. They're smaller. They kind of look like little pine trees, so sometimes they're called ground pines. But they reproduce in a similar way to ferns. And then horsetails are another type of plant. And these actually grow quite tall, so you can really see the vascular tissue development is quite impressive for these. Okay, but for the most part, the rest of the slides we're going to focus on the life cycle of ferns. Just keep in mind it's pretty similar with these as well. Okay, so before we look at the life cycle, there's a few unique things that we see in terms of specialized structures for reproduction with ferns. Okay, so if you think back to yesterday's notes, mosses have their most dominant recognizable stage are gametophytes. That's the main thing that you see when you look at moss. But for ferns, the most dominant recognizable stage is actually the diploid sporophyte phase. So whenever you think of a fern, or even like if I switch back here, these plants that you see, these are actually not gametophytes, they're sporophytes. So that's something unique. That's usually what people associate with a fern is the sporophyte phase. And then, like I said, they still make spores, but these haploid spores are made in a different place. They're actually made on the underside of the leaves. Fern leaves are called fronds, and if you look on the underside, you'll see these little bundles. Now, these bundles or clusters are called sori. I think singular it's sorus, but these little sori, if you zoom in on any one of these bunches, you'll find all of these little capsules or containers. These little capsules are called sporangia, and they're not the spores, they hold spores. Every single one of these, if you were to crack one of these open, have a bunch of spores inside of them, and so that's how spores are grown, and then how they'll be released for the life cycle. Okay, so here is the life cycle of a fern. Just like yesterday, I'm going to zoom in on each half. So here it's still alternation of generations. You have the haploid gametophyte phase here, and then you have the diploid sporophyte phase. Okay, but we'll start up here at the beginning of the haploid phase, just like we did with mosses yesterday. And so here you have one of those sporangia. Okay, but this sporangium has inside of it those spores. Okay, so these spores are haploid. Okay, so let's zoom in right here and start off this life cycle. So here you have the spores. When they, just like with mosses, when they get wet, they sprout. Okay, and so that they eventually become gametophytes. And so here's a young gametophyte coming out of a spore. These are little root-like hairs. These are rhizoids, and so these will grow out and provide an anchor for this gametophyte. But what's different with ferns, is that the gametophyte is actually a separate structure. It's not even attached to the sporophyte. At least not at first, okay? So this gametophyte is going to grow bigger and turn into a mature one that you see here. It kind of looks like a heart shape. And these are really small compared to what you'd think of as compared to the sporophyte, the actual fern plant. This is I mean, they range anywhere from like a centimeter to a couple of centimeters in diameter, so they're really small. But on the underside of them is where you'll find the reproductive organs. So one area of the gametophyte has the archegonia, so that's the female reproductive organs, and these archegonia have eggs inside them. And then another area of the gametophyte has the male parts, which are the antheridia. So here you can see some of them. This label isn't there, but these are sperm cells. So I would write sperm here. Sorry, it got cut off. Okay, so you have haploid sperm cells being made in one area and haploid egg cells being made in another area. And so this gametophyte still needs water. A little bit of water is needed to get these sperm cells to travel to where the archegonia are. And hopefully, like you can see here, some of them make their way in and fertilize the egg. And so when sperm cell and egg cell come together, whoops, you end up with a fertilized egg, okay, which is a zygote, and then eventually it becomes a sporophyte. So here's an archegonium, the female reproductive part of a gametophyte, and inside you have that sporophyte embryo. Okay, so these this sporophyte will develop, and eventually what happens is it gets to be what we consider to be the like a typical fern plant. Okay, so here's a sporophyte when it's fully developed. In fact, the gametophyte, which you can see here, eventually kind of withers away after it's done its job. It's not really a big part of the plant anymore. You can see with the mature sporophyte, the gametophyte just isn't really there anymore. It's done its part. But that sporophyte will grow and eventually turn into the fern. And here you can see a frond of that fern, and you'll have several fronds. And each of these fronds, remember the sporophyte is diploid, so this plant itself is diploid. But then if we zoom in on the underside of the fronds, that's where you'll see those sporangia, those little, well, those bundles of sporangia. And inside them is where meiosis is happening to make little spore cells again that are haploid. Okay, so that kind of starts the process all over again. Okay, so there are some similarities, like for example, here these egg cells and sperm cells are being made by mitosis. You just make many, many copies of them. That's what's happening here in the haploid phase. And then here we still have meiosis happening just like we saw with the mosses. But as you can see, there are some definite differences between this life cycle and the one that we went over yesterday on mosses. Okay, so there is going to be a bit of there's going to be a worksheet that you'll have, so you'll get a chance to compare these life cycles a bit. But in terms of these notes, we're all done. Thanks.